Assalamu alaikum dear viewers and dear students. In today's video we will discuss some of the aspects of the remaining aspects of the Cold War which I have discussed in my previous video. So if you remember, in the previous video we discussed about the origin of the Cold War, how it expanded after its development, and in today's video we will discuss some of the major incidents which occurred during the Cold War. So one such major incident which occurred at the start of the Cold War and which startled the United States of America, that was the Chinese Revolution of October 1949. When it became successful on 1st October, it proclaimed the People's Republic in China. So then China became the People's Republic of China, and that was a major setback for the United States of America during the Cold War, because China was all the way in the Second World War on the side of the United States of America, as the Soviet Union was, too was on the side of the United States. So the United States, or the allies, the capitalist allies, they did not expect that one of their major allies in the Cold War would become a socialist country. So that was a shock for them and they had their doubts in mind that definitely this socialist revolution might have been exported to China by the Soviet Union or some elements in the Soviet administration. So they did have these doubts in their mind. So this Chinese Revolution was one of the first such shocks for the United States of America after the Second World War, and that was in 1949. Then what happened, that Korea was also divided between at the end of the Second World War, when talks were held between the victorious powers. So Korea was also divided between the North Korea and the South Korea. And now in the North Korea, it was a communist regime, or the communists were ruling the North Korea, while in the South Korea it wasn't a communist regime in South Korea. 38 parallel was declared as the boundary between the North and the South, and they did not have good relations with each other. So what happened at that time, that since this socialism was expanding and it was subversive activities were occurring all around the world, so as it is there in the Marx in the Communist or the Socialist Manifesto, that they will have to export the revolutions to the rest of the world, so that the rest of the world becomes, so that the whole world becomes a classless society. So that was their one of the main agendas of socialism. So that was why wherever there would be socialism, they would try to with or without the support of someone, they would try to export it to the neighboring regions or countries. So the North Koreans, they invaded South Korea, and the United States of America, the Soviet had been withdrawn from the North after the World War, and the United States of America had also withdrawn from the South Korea, from the South Korean region. Then what happened, that when these administrations, when they were in place, the local administrations of these countries, when they were ruling the country, so the North decided to invade the South Korea. When the North invaded the South Korea, then what happened, that almost all of the South Korea, except for a place known as Busan, all of the South Korea, it was captured by the armies of the North Korea. Then the United States of America presented a resolution in the United Nations against the aggression of the North over the South Korea, and Soviet Union could veto the resolution. But at that time, the United States, since China had been, People's Republic of China had proclaimed itself as a legitimate ruler of China, or like the Communist Party of China proclaimed People's Republic of China and then the legitimate ruler of China. But the United States of America resisted giving it the seat of China in the United Nations. So the United States did not recognize the People's Republic of China, and over that issue, Soviet Union had boycotted the sessions of the United Nations. So, and on the Chinese seat, there was the representative of the Republic of China, because the People's Republic of China's representative were not allowed to be there. So that was why when the resolution was presented, there was nobody to veto the resolution, and a US mission was approved to halt the advances of the North Koreans over the South Korea. So from Busan, mainly these US missions were comprised of these UN mission forces were comprised of the US forces. So in that place, Busan, General MacArthur, he entered over there, and he tried to launch attack against the North Korean army, but he was initially defeated. Then he had to retreat, and then he had to go back and attack the enemies from behind the lines of the enemy, like take them by surprise. So that is a long story. This is explaining the Korean War over here is not the main issue, so that is why we will not go into detail. But when the North Korean army was badly beaten, defeated, and the Allied troops reached to the Yellow River, which is the geographical border between the mainland China and the Korean Peninsula. So then Chinese were alarmed, and there was a possibility of a huge confrontation over this issue, because then the war could not remain localized. While General MacArthur was impressing upon the President Roosevelt to allow him to use President Truman to allow him to use that nuclear bomb over China, so that that threat can be easily eliminated. But that was denied, and he was asked to resign, and then, or rather, he was sacked from the job. And then the 38th parallel was again made, the boundary between the North and the South Korea. But this war lasted for almost 3 years. So this was another major incident of the Cold War. Then again, another major incident of the Cold War was that of the Vietnam War. So in the Vietnam War, it started on November 1955 and lasted until 30th April 1975. So it was almost a 10 years long war. And in those 10 years, the United States of America secured the area for the South Vietnamese in 1973 and 74. So it was almost 20 years of conflict, and since Vietnam was, before the Second World War, Vietnam was a French colony. And after the war, in the North Vietnam, and the communists, they did not allow up till 1954, like the French had an administrative control after the World War II over Vietnam, but then with the backing of the United States of America. But then the communist or the socialist in the North Vietnam, they did not approve of that, and that was why they had conducted subversive activities in the South. And the American military advisors, the number of the American military advisors were increased with the passage of time, and in the 1960s almost 23,000 troops were deployed. American troops were deployed in the Vietnam to fight the communists from the North. So, and then the North had the support of China as well, and definitely if the support of China, so you can well imagine that the support of Soviet Union was there with the North as well, the support of the whole socialists nations at that time, powerful socialist nations of that time, was there with the communists of the Vietnam. In the 1974, for a brief period, 73-74, for a brief period, the United States of America managed to establish a non-communist government in the South Vietnam, but then there were political aspects of the war as well, since it was a lengthy war, and the United States of America had lost so many thousands of lives, around 50,000 of lives over the years. The United States of America had lost over there in Vietnam, and they did not know how to react to the guerrilla tactics of the socialist Vietnamese who were fighting them. So that was an issue for them. It wasn't like the Korean War. The terrain was totally different from Korea, and it was an issue for the United States of America. And over there, in the American public opinion was shifting against this war. So the American successive governments were under pressure, and then ultimately they had to withdraw. And when they withdrew in 1975, the whole of Vietnam fell to the hands of the socialist or the communist. So that was a defeat for the United States of America in the war, and that was another major incident of the Cold War, the Vietnam War. That was another major incident of the war. Then another major incident occurred again in the 1960, and that is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the analysts say, historians say, that was the first time when the possibility of the Cold War being converted into a hot war was there, but that was averted. And how that was averted, we'll just go into a little bit of detail, not that much detail, because then it will have to consume the whole lecture, which I do not want. I want to cover all of the major incidents in this chapter, in this lecture, and then one more lecture will be regarding some of the more aspects of the Cold War, and then we will be inshallah done with that. So what happened in Cuba, that in 1958 Fidel Castro, the Cuban Revolution occurred in 1958, and Fidel Castro became the ruler of Cuba, and then he was a communist as well. So he was pro-socialist, and in the backyard of the United States of America, now there was a socialist country, and they considered it, or the United States of America thought of it as a satellite of Soviet Union. So when this socialist revolution occurred and it became successful, many Cubans left Cuba, and they went to the United States of America. So from the expatriate of Cuba, the United States of America devised a ploy for Fidel Castro, and they devised a ploy, and they trained them, they supported those Cubans, and they launched them against the Cuban government. So that is known as the Bay of Pig incidents. So that was in April 1961. So when they launched that Bay of Pig, and the revolution took place in 1958, so that April 1961, this was the Bay of Pig incident. And then what happened, that Cuba became really worried about the intent. Though it was an unsuccessful attempt by the United States of America, this counter-revolutionary effort could not succeed, but it only made visible or vivid the intentions of the United States of America towards Cuba. So what happened, that the Cubans got really furious, worried about the fate of their revolution, or the fate of communism or socialism in Cuba. And on the sideline, side by side, since the United States of America was trying to encircle Soviet Union, or arrest the spread of communism of emanating from the Soviet Union in Europe, so it had installed missiles in Turkey and Italy against the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was not happy with the installation of those missiles. So when this Bay of Pig happened, and when the government of Cuba, they asked the Khrushchev at that time to provide them support against the United States of America, so that it cannot make any such efforts in future, like counter-revolutionary efforts in future. So Khrushchev agreed with that, and Khrushchev started installation of launching pads of missiles which could carry nuclear weapons in Cuba, and the target of those missiles would definitely be none other than the United States of America. It was obvious. So the United States of America spy planes, they used to fly over, they at that time, that was a stealth technology of that time, so they used to fly high above in the skies and monitor the activities of the enemies over the enemy's skies, but they could not be detected, and they would take pictures. So one such incident occurred when the United States of American spy planes, U-2, I guess it is known as U-2, when they were flying over Cuba, and they took pictures, and when they came back, and when the pictures were analyzed, so they found out in those pictures that there is a military built up over there, an installation, a site is being built, and when that was analyzed, they came to know that it is a missile launching pad. Different missile launching pads are being built, and the size of the pads is such that it can have missiles of large sizes which could carry the nuclear weapons as well. So, and then they came to know, the US intelligence later on came to know that some of the material of those missiles have already been shifted to Cuba by the Soviet Union through seas. So the United States of America, it had two options: either to attack Cuba directly or just stop the shipments coming from the east to Cuba. So naval blockade was also considered. The first option was outrightly rejected by the president, because he did not want this confrontation to this escalation to become into a full war, converted to a full war. So he did not approve of that thing. But the second option, he opted for that, and that was the naval blockade, but he gave it the name of a quarantine, not the naval blockade, because in naval blockade was also considered as an act of war, because you're blockading a whole country, and the country is surrounded by sea, and now you are going for a naval blockade. So how would that country get edibles and the rest of the things? So they gave it a name of quarantine. And in quarantine, what did they do? That they said that, okay, we will just provide you whatever necessities of life are required for you are coming towards your country, so we will not stop that, like food, we will not stop that from coming to Cuba, but we will have to thoroughly search all the shipments which are coming to Cuba, so that no contrabands or no weapons is transferred to Cuba. Then the US ships or submarines, the USSR ships and submarines were already on the way to Cuba. The US blockade or quarantine was there, and the US spy planes were flying over the skies or over the seas in that region. So a US spy plane was shot down by the Soviets during those 13 days of crisis. It was shot down by the Soviets. What happened that when its submarine, then as a reaction, when the submarine of the USSR, a nuclear submarine of the USSR, was coming deep under this in the sea towards Cuba or towards the United States of America. So in order to give them a warning, to give that submarine a warning, the United States of America detonated a small bomb in front of that submarine. Like, it did not damage the submarine, but just away from the submarine, just to give it a warning not to proceed further. So what happened that the submarine, since it was deep in water and the telecommunication technology wasn't that developed, it later on it was revealed that it tried to contact Moscow about it, but it could not reach Moscow. So it had a standing order that if you feel that there is a threat and there is a war, you can launch a nuclear missile against the United States of America from the Atlantic Ocean in the waters. And the mechanism for that was that there were 3 officers in the submarine. So the decision making power was given to the consensus of those 3 officers. If those 3 officers would agree on that point, then they would launch the attack. So out of those 3 officers, 2 agreed, but 1 did not agree. The 2 thought that that is a war, the war has begun, because they could not communicate to the outside world, and now we should launch this missile on the United States of America. But 1 said, and that was a nuclear bomb, and 1 said that no, we should not launch. We should first confirm and then act accordingly or respond accordingly. So that missile wasn't launched, and the world was saved from a major nuclear conflagration between the two nuclear powers. The world was saved. That was one aspect. Then Robert Kennedy, who was the brother of John F. Kennedy, he and the USSR diplomat or ambassador in the United States of America, they both met. And when they both met with each other, they discussed the prospects of peace. A hotline was established between Moscow and Washington so that the presidents could talk to each other directly before taking any drastic decision about each other countries or about wars. So this was a highly volatile situation for the whole world. And then after those negotiations, behind the scene diplomacy, the United States of America agreed, the Soviet Union agreed to dismantle its missiles launching pad in Cuba. But in return, the Soviet Union asked the United States of America to dismantle or remove the missiles from Italy and Turkey, which the Soviet Union considered as a threat to them. So the United States of America agreed on that point, and USSR agreed on this point. And this is how that major threat to the existence of human race at that time was averted by the good offices, by the brinkmanship, by the diplomacy and the second track diplomacy. At that time, Nikita Khrushchev, he was criticized by the people in his country, the public in his country. Kennedy was criticized because people in both countries accused them of bowing to the pressures from the enemy. But they did not consider those oppositions from the public, and they took their decisions, which were at that time in both the countries not very popular decisions, but they took those decisions in the larger interest of their nations and definitely of the whole world. That was the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was another very major incident. And without this Cuban Missile Crisis, if you minus this Cuban Missile Crisis from the Cold War, so the rest of the incidents in the Cold War, they were not that serious. Yeah, like the threat of a nuclear war could not be there. There was one incident in the Korean War when the Chinese were pushing back. The troops of General MacArthur, and it was feared that if General MacArthur if he does not opt to come back or to retreat, so the Soviet might interfere on behalf of the Chinese in Korea, and then the Soviet had the nuclear weapons at that time. So that was not that much potent threat, though it was a threat, but this Cuban Missile Crisis was a very potent threat, and it was averted. So it will not be wrong if we say that diplomacy saved the world at that time. It was diplomacy which saved the world, though the militaries of both countries, they were quite ready, and one miscalculation could do extreme harm to the whole world. But that one miscalculation could not be allowed, and as I have discussed the issue of the submarine, even over there this one miscalculation was not allowed to be committed. Then in 1979, the Afghan War. So this Afghan War, I will end my today's lecture over the Afghan War, and then the rest of the things about the Cold War, we will discuss that in the next lecture. So Afghanistan, as we all know, that Afghanistan had a kingdom. King Zahir Shah was there. Then after Zahir Shah in 1973, Dawood came into power and Zahir Shah was sent into exile. And then the Khalq and Parcham parties were there, and Khalq particularly, so they were communist. And they were trying to install communist government in Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan, this revolution or communist activities were already going on in the 1970s, because it was directly linked or it was bordering the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's border were there up till Afghanistan, because all the Central Asian republics, they came out of the womb of Soviet Union after the disintegration of Soviet Union in the 1990s, but they were part of the Soviet Union. So the boundaries of Soviet Union were there with Afghanistan, and that is why it was easy from the territory of Soviet Union for the revolutionaries to conduct their activities in Afghanistan and prepare the ground for a socialist revolution in Afghanistan. So the civil war began in Afghanistan. Then the Saur revolution came in the 1975-76, and this Nur Muhammad Tariqi, Hafizullah Amin and Babrak Karmal. So these were three rulers of Afghan history after Dawood, who were of communist ideologies, and they wanted to install communism in Afghanistan, install the communist government in Afghanistan. So Nur Muhammad Tariqi was killed by Hafizullah Amin, and Hafizullah Amin later on, even the Soviet considered him a threat for the socialist activities in Afghanistan, because they were quite radical, and the Soviet Union did not want the socialism in Afghanistan to be that much radical, because they wanted the people to accept the ideals of socialism first, and later on this revolution or subversive activities be started. But like the nature of Afghanis, the impatient nature of Afghanis and the Pashtuns at large. I myself am a Pashtun, so I'm not shy of saying it. So this impatient nature of the Pashtuns, they did not wait for a long time for the socialist ideologies or the socialist ideals to be absorbed or digested by the Afghan people. They wanted to install it at once, and it created a problem for the people living in Afghanistan. And most of the people in Afghanistan, they were living in rural areas, and they were like the rural elite, you might call. They were the noblemen of their areas, and large tracts of land were there. And when socialism came, they had to lose all these lands. This was one of the factors. They had to lose all these lands. So a resistance against the socialism erupted in Afghanistan even before the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. You need to keep this in mind. A resistance, because they had to, as a result of socialism, there is no concept of private property. So the resistance from the rural areas where people would have large tracts of land and a lot of properties. So this resistance came from them even before the invasion of Soviet Union in Afghanistan. What happened that when the local or the pawns or the stooges of Soviet Union in shape of Babrak Karmal, Hafizullah Amin and Nur Muhammad Tariqi, when they and Babrak Karmal, the last one, so when they could not curb the revolution, they directly asked the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan so that their revolutionary efforts be succeeded. So this was the scenario in 1979 when Soviet Union then invaded Afghanistan. So when Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1975, the United States of America had recently been defeated in Vietnam, and now in 1975, the United States had been defeated in Vietnam, and now in 1979, the Soviet Union is invading Afghanistan. So you can well imagine what will happen. Right? And the Soviet Union, there were other factors behind the Soviet invasions, like in my previous lecture I said that there was Iranian Revolution. So this Iranian Revolution was looked at by the Soviet Union as well, and the Soviet Union was spreading socialism in the area, and then there was an Islamic Revolution in Iran. So the Soviet Union also wanted to retain this sphere of influence. So they invaded Afghanistan, while the United States of America lose a partner as a result of the Iranian Revolution. Reza Shah Pahlavi was their partner. So this revolution was looked at by both sides, not with not in favorable terms. So that was why the United States of America supported it. This war lasted from 1979 up till from December 1979 up till February 1989. This lasted. What happened during that war? that most of these Pashtuns, they migrated to Pakistan, they left their families in Pakistan, and then voluntarily, I again say voluntarily, most of them, they went back to Afghanistan to fight for their rights, for their properties, whatever, or for the sake of Islam, whatever that was. And most of them were inspired by the idea of jihad in Afghanistan. So the United States of America considered this as an opportunity for itself. And Pakistan, as there was a Rawalpindi conspiracy in the 1951 against the government of Liaquat Ali Khan, and it was a socialist conspiracy. It was an effort, an attempt in Pakistan by the like-minded people of Soviet Union to install in the military and in the academia and in the civil administration, to install a socialist government in Afghanistan, in Pakistan. That was in 1951. That revolution, that conspiracy was countered. It was failed. It got failed because of timely action by the military leadership. But that was, some of the people in military were also involved in that. That was one incident. The other incident, which I will discuss in this class after this topic, sorry, I said that I will finish this with this topic, I will finish the discussion, but the other topic is linked and I will discuss that other topic before the class is finished or this lecture is finished. So the other issue was that there was open involvement of the Soviet intelligence in the situation in East Pakistan when they were supporting the Mukti Bahini, a rebel group in East Pakistan, which was fighting for independence from Pakistan, and the Indians and the Soviet Union, the Indians and the Russians of the Soviets, they would call them the freedom fighters. So there was the involvement of Russian intelligence agency, open involvement of Russian intelligence agency in the East Pakistan fiasco as well. So what happened? That when in 1979 this Afghanistan was invaded, Pakistan really felt threatened because of the general policies of USSR, the expansionist ideas of USSR, but then two specific incidents which hit Pakistan, one in 1951 and one in 1970s or 71. So these were the two incidents which inspired Pakistani administration to support the resistance against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and this resistance was definitely there by the local people. Pakistan then started supporting them. Training camps were established in the then federally administered tribal area of Pakistan, and then these fighters would come. They would leave their families in Pakistan, in Balochistan and mostly in KP. They would leave their families and then they would get training and go back to Afghanistan and fight the Soviets. The United States of America also came to the war and started supporting Pakistan. What happened that 7 groups of Mujahideen were identified by the Pakistan. So the United States of America would provide its military aid to Pakistan, to the ISI in Pakistan, and then the ISI would transport it from the ports of Karachi up to Afghanistan and then distribute it among those. So the operational responsibility was there of Pakistan, and the economic and military aid was provided. The economic aid was provided by both Saudi Arabia and the United States of America, and military aid was largely provided by the United States of America, and training and skills and all these things, they were given jointly by the officers of the United States, the military officers of the United States and Pakistan, but mainly Pakistan. So this war was fought and the Soviet Union was defeated in Afghanistan. As a result of this almost 10 years long war, it was defeated, and after that defeat, then the economy of Soviet Union was also hit, and then there are some more incidents, but that was one of the, I will discuss that more incident in which the Cold War would be brought to a conclusion. These 3 series of lectures would be brought to a conclusion. So how it finished later on, I will be discussing that. But up till now, this was the Afghan issue. Now what happened in the East Pakistan? That was also one of the theaters of the Cold War. that East Pakistan or the 1971 war of India and Pakistan, that was one of the theaters of the Cold War. And since the United States of America was an ally of Pakistan, so Pakistan was expecting the US to come to the rescue, to come to its rescue. But the problem was that the USS Enterprise, which was a fleet aircraft carrier, it did not come to the rescue of Pakistan on time. And the pretext which it presented was that we would come to your rescue only because we are your ally, you are in Santo, you are in Seattle. So we are allies in these agreements. But that alliance is against socialism, against the spread of communism. And now you have a local war going on with India. So we have nothing to do with that. Apparently their aircraft was there, but it never came to the rescue of Pakistan. And in East Pakistan, just briefly, let me tell you briefly that there were many mistakes on our part as well in Pakistan. There was the 1970s election were there, and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and his Awami League, they won the election. But over here, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had also secured seats in the West Pakistan, but the number of seats in the West Pakistan secured by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was far less than the number of seats in the East Pakistan. In East Pakistan, he secured 183, I guess, seats, and over here Zulfikar Ali Bhutto or the People's Party secured 76 or 77 seats out of 79. So that was a problem, but Zulfikar Ali Bhutto did not allow him, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, to formulate the government. That was a very, I would say, selfish decision on part of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and he has to be blamed in this East Pakistan fiasco. Or the debacle of East Pakistan. He has to be blamed for it because his resistance or his stubbornness or his conservativeness not to allow people from the East Pakistan to make a government, a central government or a federal government in the whole of Pakistan, became the final act or the final nail in the coffin of the East Pakistani people, because they had already raised their concerns against the discrimination by the establishment in the West Pakistan over the years. They had raised their concerns time and time again, but Pakistani establishment, the ruling elite, the political elite, they did not allow them to come to the fore and lead the country. So that was one mistake by the Pakistani establishment. And then India and the Soviet Union, they cashed that opportunity. So that was then when the Mukti Bahini efforts were started. After that, the efforts were started. Rebels were trained in Indian territory by the KGB and the Indian RAW, and then those rebels were even exported to, those rebels were transported to Bangladesh or East Pakistan, and since it was a propaganda, and it such a huge propaganda that it is now being revealed that even in the military uniforms of Pakistani army, those rebels would be transported to East Pakistan. They would be given the military uniform of the Pakistan army, and then they would go and they would commit atrocities over many people in order to malign Pakistan and impress upon the people that, see, this is what Pakistan is doing with you, we need to fight for the independence. And recently these revelations have come from the Indian retired generals who were serving at that time. So this is not something concocted. So these revelations have come from the Indian retired generals, and that can be seen in different vlogs by the Indians, by the Pakistani journalists, and you can Google it and you will find it. So it was another act of the Cold War, and these were the four major incidents, like Korea, then Vietnam in the Indochina, and then Afghanistan, and then this East Pakistan and the Cuban Missile Crisis, so, and the Chinese Revolution. So all these 6 incidents which I elaborated, these were some of the major incidents in the Cold War in which different theaters were there, and situation was being monitored, and states, countries would maneuver their policies accordingly. Inshallah, in the next class, I will discuss some of the more aspects, the technological aspects of the Cold War, and then I will try to conclude this topic in that lecture and not stretch it over the fourth lecture. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. Goodbye.